have Julia Fonseca with us. She's going to present the real effects of banking the poor, evidence from Brazil. Julia, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Let me share my screen. Okay, so the basic motivating fact behind this paper is that a lot of people don't have access to financial products and services. I think it's fair to say that there's a consensus in the literature that finance does matter for economic development, but we know a lot less about why it matters. So how does finance lead to economic growth, through what exact channels? And how is that growth shared? What are the distributional consequences of that growth? So we tackle both of these questions in this paper, and we're essentially asking, how does lifting regions from financial autarky affect both economic development and also wage inequality? So I just, before moving on, I want to highlight that this effect on inequality is ex ante not obvious, right? So if you make the kind of standard set of assumptions that you would find in most macro finance development models, you might conclude that financial development should lead to lower income inequality and perhaps no effect on wage inequality. Because as firms grow, they're going to demand more labor, which these models assume is homogeneous. So you're going to see higher wages across the board. But you could make a different set of assumptions that would lead you to conclude that wage inequality should go up with financial inclusion. So you could think that something about access to finance is going to allow for a better matching between workers and firms, right? So either workers can maybe wait longer for that, perfect job, or firms have more resources to find those workers. But if you find that better matching between workers and firms, that might spread out the wage distribution and lead to more wage inequality. Or you could think of a channel like what I proposed in my job market paper, which is as firms access more credit, they invest more. And because there are complementarities between capital and skills, they demand more skilled workers. That drives up the skill premium and that pushes up wage inequality. Or instead, regardless of what's happening on the demand side, if firms are demanding more skilled workers, or if you're demanding, the same amount of skilled and unskilled workers, you could still see higher inequality if the supply of skills is scarce. So if there's just more unskilled workers available than skilled workers. And, spoiler alert, we're going to find evidence for that third channel here. So the way that we're going to approach this question is we're going to study a program that was introduced in Brazil in 2004, where the Brazilian government started placing government-owned banks in cities that were not previously served by those banks. And we're going to use this as a shock to access to finance, and we're going to study this in a diff and diff research design. What I'm gonna start by showing you is that this reform worked, which is certainly never a given. I'm going to show you that it did lead to a large positive shock to financial development. I'll then show you what the aggregate effect is, and that is very consistent with prior work on finance and development, and that is access to finance leads to higher employment, firm growth, higher average wages. What's a bit more novel about this paper is I'm going to show you evidence that this is because of monitoring costs or soft information or other types of transaction costs that are being alleviated by this access to finance, instead of, for instance, alternative theories like high fixed costs. I'll then conclude by showing you the distributional effect, and that's basically that we're going to see an increase in the Gini index of about 7%, and that's not going to be driven by lower wages at the bottom of the distribution, but rather by a large increase in wages at the top. And I'm going to show you evidence that this is indeed driven by skills scarcity. Okay, let me skip through all this very important prior work in the interest of time and rather just jump into the institutional details of this program. So the program is called Banco para Todos, or we're translating it as Banks for All. It was introduced in 2004, and it was part of that, 2004 to 2007 Plano Plurianual. So the goal, the very, stated goal of this program was to promote the physical presence of government-owned banks. That was done both through bank branches, but also through those corresponding banking outlets, right? So that is when a bank teams up with, a local retailer, and to have that retailer provide some of those services. According to the government, by 2007, public banks had opened 7.8 million new accounts and banked, a little under 1.5 million low-income people. And, just to show you that you can actually see this reform in the aggregate, I'm showing you the share of municipalities without bank branches. Both municipalities without a branch of a government-controlled bank, that's the red line at the top, but also the share of municipalities without any bank. Okay, so that's the blue line at the bottom. And hopefully it is very apparent that you don't really see much movement in the share of cities without banks. But after the program is introduced, that starts dropping quite significantly. I'll also note that, according to the government, we unfortunately don't have data on banking correspondence, but according to the government, if you include banking correspondence, there was one in every city by 2007. So if we were able to include this, the share of cities without any bank, according to this definition that includes correspondence, should have reached 0 by 2007, but we're unfortunately not able to see that in our data. And what data is that? We're going to have matched employer-employee data from HICE, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's going to give us the universe of tax-registered firms in Brazil, so basically the entire formal sector. We're going to see not only wages, but also things like education, which is going to allow us to proxy for skills. We're also going to see occupation, race, age, gender, which are going to be very helpful for showing you that, the effects that we find on inequality are not driven by the composition of workers that are in the labor market. Because we are interested in those distributional effects, we're going to aggregate this to the city level. So our outcomes are basically going to have to do with city level employment and the city level distribution of wages. We're going to use data from ESTIBA, which is going to tell us about, whether there's a branch of a bank in a certain city, how much credit is on the balance sheet of those banks. But of course, with the one caveat that we're not going to see corresponding banking outlets. Okay, so after I show you the effect of the reform, I'm going to loop back to this and tell you what that means about how we can interpret our magnitudes. And we're also going to merge in, of course, a bunch of city characteristics that is they're just going to help us control for other confounders that might affect our treatment and our control groups differentially. Okay, so on this empirical strategy, as I mentioned, we're going to have this diff and def research designed. Our treatment group is going to be cities that did not have a branch of a government-controlled bank before 2004. And the control group is going to be cities with a public bank before 2004. Since this is a diff and diff, the key identifying assumption is, of course, that treatment and control would have evolved in close parallel absent the reform. I'm going to discuss this more deeply. I'm going to, show you evidence for parallel trends. I'm going to talk about, threats to identification, but I'm going to start with just a more basic one, which is, hey, cities with a bank are potentially very different than cities, without a bank, and that's of course our first, potential source of concern, and they truly are. So here are just, standardized differences in means for cities with and without bank, according to a lot of different characteristics. And as we would expect, they are smaller, they are poorer, they're more exposed to the commodity sector, they're less likely to have voted for Lula or for a left-leaning party in the last election. They're less integrated according to some measures. So just, a wide range of things for us to be concerned with. So our approach to this is to have a matching estimator. So if we just match on population, so here what we're doing is we're taking the population distribution, splitting into quintiles, and only admitting into our control group cities that are in the same quintile. Okay, and just by doing that exact match on population quintile, you can see that accounts for, a lot of these ex-ante differences between treated and control cities, with, one glaring exception, and that is, the growth in the Gini index in this pre-reform period. So what our approach to this, since we are interested in these inequality outcomes, is we're going to match on Gini growth before the reform. We're going to do a nearest neighbor algorithm. We're going to take the 3 closest. Okay, so when we do that, we end up, with near balance in this broad set of covariates, and all estimates are within this 0.2 band, which suggests that this is a successful matching procedure. I am going to show you other evidence on this, but let me start by showing you something that we're not concerned with, and that is geographical clustering, because we don't see it. So I'm here showing you in red are treated cities, in blue are control cities. We don't have much evidence of geographical clustering. We do show in the appendix that our results are robust to only comparing treated and control cities within the same state. Okay, so it's really not driven by any kind of obvious differences between these regions. So here is our baseline specification. So an observation for us is going to be a city belonging to a matched pair or matched group, because we do have 3 controls per treated in year T. So treated is just going to be this indicator variable that's going to be 1 if the city did not have a branch of a government-controlled bank before 2004. We're going to add in city fixed effects, because we want to use only within city variation to estimate our coefficients, and we're going to have match by year fixed effects. Okay, so we're also only going to be using this within match year variation, and this is going to be helpful since we do show that control and treatment groups are balanced across a very wide range of covariates. So if you're worried about correlations between these covariates and the program, having those match year fixed effects in there is going to help account for a lot of these correlations. And just to be very clear about what we're assuming here, we're certainly not assuming that the presence of government banks is random. Okay, we would not like to have to defend that assumption, nor does this identification assumption strategy require us to have common support in the level of covariance. Although, of course, that might make our real identification assumption, which is parallel trends, that might help make it more plausible. Okay, but the true identifying assumption here is that treated and control cities would have evolved in parallel absent the reform, and I am going to show you evidence of that. Before I do, let me just discuss, some of the key threats to identification that you might already be thinking about. Of course, we're also concerned with any shocks that happened around the time of the reform that are specific to our treatment group. The most common version of this concern is, what if these government-controlled banks were also being used for other programs around that time, right? So Bolsa Familia is a very important example, or maybe other politically driven types of credit expansion. How are we going to disentangle that from our program? So we're going to have specific tests for this in the appendix that I might not get a chance to talk about. But one thing that I think gets us a really long way towards addressing these concerns is that our control cities have a branch of these public banks. Okay, so to the extent that there are politically driven credit expansions around this time, our control groups should also have benefited. To the extent that these banks are being used to promote these welfare programs that are also being expanded around this time, our control cities should also benefit from this. And another very important cause for concern is ex-ante differences, right? We're concerned that treated and controlled cities just differ in some important way, and that correlates with aggregate shocks around this time. So our matching procedure, I think, really helps us here. As I showed you, we do get balance across a large set of covariates. We also do kind of a lot more here. We control for basically any differences in pre-reform levels that we can get our hands on. We add to this regression. We show that that does not affect our results. We show that these treated and controlled cities were in parallel trends prior to this reform. We also take this analysis to the city by industry level and add industry times year fixed effects. So let's say you're concerned that these cities are still somehow more exposed to commodities. I can compare the same sector in a treated city, in a control city before and after this reform, and everything that I'm going to tell you today is going to go through. So what am I going to tell you? Starting with the aggregate effect, I'm going to show you that this reform worked. Okay, so it did lead to a substantial increase in the probability of having a bank branch. So that's going to average to around 20 percentage points throughout this post period. And very importantly, this is driven by public banks. Okay, we really don't see much going on in private banks around this time, which we take as evidence that our identification strategy is doing a good job of controlling for that private credit boom, which we all know was happening in Brazil around this time. Okay, so we see that public banks expand into these cities quite substantially, and that leads to an overall increase in the probability of having a bank branch.
Julia, may I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
From this graph, the last graph, the graph that is in the screen, the opening of the public branch, it's not all in at once. It's steady growing. Right. So I believe strongly that there would be some political reasons for opening first in some cities than in others, and that the cities that had the political power to get the branch earlier, perhaps I think likely, they will have other type of subsidies from the government, investments from the government. Don't you think
that's a fair? Sure, that's a fair point. And it's actually a great argument for why we don't use the timing of when you got the bank. Okay, so our treatment, our estimates are going to be whether you or not you had a bank, and interacted with whether time is before or after 2004. So there's a lot of variation in who gets a bank when that we're not going to exploit, and we're not going to exploit it precisely because we agree that there would be concerns here about the timing of who gets a bank. So we're not using that variation at all.
Okay, but don't you think that perhaps the results will come from the counties or from the cities that have political power, and what's making them grow is perhaps the other investments and not the opening of the bank that I think is the goal of your study too.
So we're going to have specific ways that we're going to try to kind of rule out other alternatives. So we're going to try to control for variables that speak to politics directly. So those are going to be, among the broad set of controls that we're going to throw at these results. But if this was purely that some cities got a bank, and at the same time they got other investments, this would look very different than what we're seeing. in terms of, what we're finding is our credit effects are entirely driven by public banks. The timing of our reform is entirely consistent, even at the sector level with this reform, and we can rule out kind of a lot of different explanations through our controls and through the patterns that we're seeing. And the fact that we're not using the timing of who exactly gets this money when, I think does a lot to kind of alleviate this idea that it's just, cities with political connections are just getting these funds first.
Hello,
And we can try to
Julia.
control for proxies of political connections. Hi.
Is this study also related with the state or the city? Because it is related with the amount of people that occupy the state or a city, and the money is going to be proportional. Do you know what I mean? So when we talk about this, there is a limit, there is a deadline, and it's a national program. It can't belong to one city rather than others, so it's national, but it's also related with people, and it's related with the company's power and the PIB of the city and the state. Does this study show something related with the specific population that would thrive or not about this government branch?
Right. So the best we could do in that sense is through our matching procedure, these cities are going to look similar in a lot of these dimensions. So they are actually going to have, the same population on average, the same local GDP on average. Government expenditures is one of the variables that, it's the sixth variable there at the top. So, the governments seem to be raising the similar amounts of money, spending similar amounts of money, and we can add any of these pre-level differences interacted with year fixed effects, and that does not explain our results in the slightest. So, that's the evidence that we can provide that this is not driven by, differences in population or GDP or government spending or government resources at the local level.
I totally agree. I totally agree with you, because it's a matter of companies and workforce. You need a company to have an organic growth. You know what I mean? So you need employees, you need companies, you need business. You don't need government money, public money, but it's kind of an investment to a specific group of people. And I think if you put if you measure the people ability to thrive or to get a better life, increase the money, as you said, it would show it would show a bigger view, like how many companies went to their areas. But I know that at the end it's all about the GDP. But the main reason is, like people get a better perspective in companies.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. So if the question is, are we going to show firm entry as an outcome? We are. Or are you concerned about differences in firm composition? You mentioned also, the availability of employees. This is also similar across treated and control. And we are going to look at, things like firm growth and firm's ability to thrive as an outcome. I'm not sure that answers the question.
I totally agree with you, because the growth of the city is not related with the public money. It's related with the business and the job opportunities. But if you are talking about government branches, it's related with people, not specific companies. So if you
I think I understand your question better now. Correct me if I'm wrong. I guess you're saying you could also, we're very focused on the effect on firms being able to raise money and grow and start businesses, but you could also see an effect on the worker side.
That's it.
we're gonna, when we try to understand the mechanisms that are driving what we're finding, we're gonna test a lot of different theories that are more related to people than to firms. And again, we're gonna find that our effect seems to be driven by firms. So that is what explains our focus on firms, is that, our results seem to suggest that they're the driving force behind what we're seeing.
Sorry, I'd like to ask you something, please.
Sure.
You are using the opening of branches in cities as a proxy to something else, because a branch is a small building with people personally working in that place, but the banking service does not need a branch to reach people. To reach people in firms, we have forms of using technology to make the same without a building with people in that city. Branches are closing nowadays because they are not anymore necessary. And I don't know if you need to see opening of branches without measuring the banking service going through those cities, because you have other means to make the same. You have payment institutions nowadays. You have the mere use of cell phone apps to make the same without the need to open a branch in a city.
I think that it's very important context that this was in 2004. So in 2004, I would argue that branches were a lot more important than they are now. I would definitely agree that if we were doing this study right now, it would be strange to put so much emphasis on the physical presence of branches. But I think in 2004, arguably there was indeed a correlation between whether there was a branch in your city and your access to these financial products and services. And I think that's evidenced by the aggregate effects that we find that are consistent with, the credit that we start seeing these public banks extending in these cities. I'm gonna hopefully get to show you these aggregate results, and they're gonna be kind of hard to explain if there was no shock to financial inclusion. So let me see if I can show you some of these results. So I showed you some evidence that this reform did lead to financial inclusion. So we see more branches. We also see more credit in these cities, new credit per capita, also new deposits, which I'm not going to show you, but all of this is driven by government controlled banks with very minimal crowding out from private banks, meaning that this is leading to expansion in total credit to these cities. And then the next thing that I should discuss is, I just told you that we don't see these banking correspondents, which were also an important component to this reform. So the way that we think about these magnitudes is we think that the reduced form is probably the estimate of the true shock, which is, do you have access to these banking services? So we're not going to try to rescale our coefficients in, for instance, NIV research design, because if we're underestimating our first stage and we compute elasticities, we're going to overestimate these elasticities. So our approach is just, take the estimates from our reduced form as the effect of, getting access to banking services. So here are some of these reduced form. So here's the effect on the number of firms. So average throughout this period, we get, an about 10% increase in the number of firms in treated cities, very consistent with the timing of this reform. We also see an increase in employment, also of around 10%, and a much more modest increase in average wages. Okay, so the increase in the average wage is under 5%. So let me see if I have time to talk that much about. So this is one of the tests that I had alluded to about, we ask if this is about people or firms, right? So it could be that people are getting more credit, they're funneling that towards consumption, and this is just driving local demand. That would be very different than, firms are now able to borrow and start a business or expand their business. performance. So we're going to do the typical test here, which we're going to compare tradable sectors and non-tradables. And if anything, we find that the effect on tradables is larger than non-tradables, which is not consistent with this being fueled by, just a local demand shock promoted by this program. And so since this does seem consistent with this business development channel, we want to ask, why does the physical presence of a bank matters? And we try to test kind of two different theories, pit them against each other. One is that local intermediaries have an advantage in either screening or monitoring borrowers. Okay, so they're somehow able to reduce some transaction costs or some intermediation costs by being present in these cities. Another reason why intermediaries might matter is if there are non-convex investment costs. So let's say there's a large cost to entering into certain industries, then that's going to, hurt the ability of entrepreneurs to save out of financing constraints. So these are two kind of very popular assumptions in these types of macro development models. And we're going to, come up with tests for both of these and see which seems to better explain our results. So with the monitoring costs or soft information, the typical prediction here is that the further you are from a bank, the more you would benefit from getting a bank, okay? Because local banks are better at screening and monitoring borrowers. So we're going to measure just that. We're going to measure the distance to the nearest city with the bank. And we are going to find that the effect is much stronger in cities that were very far from a bank. So we're going to take this as evidence that's consistent with this theory of monitoring costs or soft information. An alternative is, maybe some sectors are just hard to enter because they have very high fixed or set up costs, and that can lead to poverty traps, right? So entrepreneurs can't save out of these financing constraints. The prediction here would be you should see more entry into large scale sectors. And we're going to proxy for a scale with the exact, kind of measure that comes out of these models, which is the average establishment size in a given industry. So we're going to split industries based on their ex-ante scale, and we're actually going to see less entry into large scale sectors. Okay, so we're going to say that our evidence is not consistent with this idea that the importance of banks is being driven by non-convex costs, and instead it's very consistent with this idea that local intermediaries just help alleviate some frictions, either in monitoring costs or soft information or other types of transaction costs. And then finally, this is our distributional result, and that is we see an increase in the Gini index of just over 2 points by the end of our sample, which is roughly 7% of the pre-reform mean. Okay, and when we plot, the change in the wage distribution. So here, what I'm doing is showing you the effect on the average wage in each quartile. So splitting the wage distribution in 4, taking the average in each bin, and just showing the effect for that bin. Okay, and it's interesting because you see this spreading out in the wage distribution, where the higher up you were initially before the reform, the more you gain. Okay, so we find this very large effect on wages for workers who were already at the top of the distribution before. So the last, set of mechanisms that we want to look at is mechanisms that can explain why you would see that spreading out of the wage distribution, these gains very heavily concentrated at the top as a result of access to finance. Okay, so we're going to think about 3 different possibilities. One is better matching or stronger sorting. So here's another way in which we, at least in theory, allow for this effect to be driven by people. Okay, so there's work showing that when you give people credit, they can find better jobs. Okay, they maybe can access jobs that are further away, and that, theory would predict that maybe productive workers can match with productive firms, and maybe that is why you're seeing this increase in wages at the top. We don't find evidence consistent with that. Okay, so one prediction that comes out of this type of model is if there's better matching, firms are gonna they're gonna be willing to accept a narrower set of workers. And so you should see lower dispersion of worker abilities within a firm. Okay, so firms are gonna start hiring workers that look a lot more alike. We don't see that at all. We proxy for worker ability using average lifetime wages. We actually find a within firm dispersion goes up. So our result in inequality is not just driven by cross firm inequality, within firm inequality, which is going to correlate with this measure of average lifetime wages, is also going up. The other channel that we think about is this just that the demand for skills is going up a lot more than the demand for unskilled labor? So this is something I look at in my job market paper. And a key prediction here, which is something that I find in that setting, is that if there are no other frictions and the demand for skills is going up by a lot more than the demand for unskilled labor, you should see differences in quantities. You should see more skilled workers at these firms. And we're going to proxy for skills with education, which is pretty typical within this literature. And we're just not going to see that. We're going to find, a negligible change in the share of skilled workers in these cities. So we're left looking for, what friction might explain this if these other theories don't seem to reconcile all of our results. And what we come up with and find evidence for is that the supply of skills is scarce. Okay, and that is what's going to end up driving up the price of labor at the top. So how can that happen? Well, if skills are scarce, then as the demand for labor expands, you're going to see an increase in the skill premium. Okay, basically what we're saying is, wages are going to have to go up a lot more at the top as, the demand for those workers exceeds the supply. So this can be true even if, labor demand rises uniformly across skills. Okay, you could still see that increase in the skill premium, which can lead to higher wage inequality. So one prediction here would be that, if this is really about skill scarcity, then inequality should rise less where the supply of skills is larger. So we're going to proxy for the supply of skills in two different ways. We're agnostic about which way is better. Results are going to be very consistent across these two measures. One I think is very intuitive is we're going to take the share of the college educated population. So that's going to be based on the 2000 census. And what we're going to say is, well, if the share of college educated population is very high, then there's probably less scarcity in that city. There's less skill scarcity. The other measure we're going to come up with is we're going to try comparing the skill premium in that city relative to control cities. So our idea is if the skill premium is low relative to control cities, then probably you don't have a lot of skill scarcity to begin with. Okay, so we're going to sort cities based on these two different proxies for the supply of skills that we're going to construct using pre-reform data only. And of course, this entire analysis hinges on workers not moving freely, right? If workers can kind of just snap their fingers and transport to another city with higher wages, then there is no local supply of skills. There's only a national supply of skills. So we do document that these workers are not moving as a consequence of this reform, which is something that has been shown in prior work too, that migration is just very costly in Brazil, unfortunately. So here's the last table that I want to show you. The dependent variable in all columns. Please go ahead.
Do you have a slide with some summary statistics on the skills that are in your sample?
I do have a summary statistics table. Let me see if we remember if we have that. We do have the share of skills. Okay, it's not split by treated and controlled though, but we do have that for our treated and controlled sample pulled together.
It's 9% for the whole sample.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Julia, a more anecdotal one. Do you have examples of what kind of professions that had their wages up?
I don't actually. That's an interesting point. You would like to see kind of one thing
For
that I'll say though.
Yeah, for example, now that my income is higher, I go to the dentist or to the physician. I don't know.
Ricardo, was thinking something like once your firm gets credit from a bank, you need some kind of formal accounting process, or
something
you
like
cannot
that.
do things by the seat of your pants. So you probably have some kind of these accounting related professions, perhaps.
Let me say two things on those points. No, the short answer is no. I'm sorry, I don't have examples of occupations, but let me say two things about that. One, we show in the appendix that even if you residualize wages from occupation, you're going to get a very similar coefficient on inequality. So this is not driven necessarily by the composition of occupations. The other thing I want to say is all your examples of accountants and the dentist, that's all of those are non-tradables, right? And if anything, we find that our results are stronger for tradables. So it's not consistent with this idea that it's just, now I have money and I go to the dentist. I would say that our results are not consistent with that, but we could definitely, try to put a bit more color into that on the occupation side. Okay, but let me take the last 3 minutes and just walk you through what this table is showing you. The dependent variables, the Gini index in all columns. The first column is just our baseline effect. So the average increase throughout the post period is 1.2 points. And then, what this triple difference is showing you is how does the effect on inequality differs relative to the emitted category, and the emitted category is always going to be high scarcity, right? And so cities that have a low skill gap have lower skill scarcity. Cities that have a high share of the population that is college educated, we're also going to call that low scarcity. And so those highlighted coefficients are showing us the marginal effect. So how much lower is the effect on inequality in those low scarcity cities? And not only do we find that the effect on inequality is lower where the supply of skills is higher, the way that you get the coefficient for that low scarcity category is you add up, right, the two coefficients in the same column. And what we're going to see is that they're very close to zero. So not only do we find that the effect on inequality is lower where the supply of skills is higher, it is very close to zero. So this is going to be, something that we're going to take as evidence that our effects are driven by the scarcity of skills at the local level. Not sure I have time to tell you about all of the robustness checks that we do, but we do try to, think about a lot of these threats to identification that I mentioned. So I did mention welfare programs. I also talk about how we residualize wages from a lot of worker characteristics. We also restrict to workers and firms who are in the sample. So I think that that's kind of a very effective way of shutting down composition, particularly, no one brought this up, but if you're worried about informality, we are going to find very similar effects on inequality if we just look at workers who are already in the formal sector. So this is definitely not driven by flows in and out of informality. So let me conclude with what I think are kind of two big picture takeaways from this work. One is that skill differentiation is important for thinking about financial development and its effect on economic development. I think that that's not a given, and I would say that because most macro finance development models don't have skill differentiation. And this is kind of a point that we're hoping to make, that you should, if you want to understand what's the distributional impact of these policies. And the other thing that I think our results potentially allude to, and that we're hoping to exploit further in future work, is that maybe you need more than one policy in order to get the full benefits of financial access, right? So we're hopefully convincing you that there is an interaction between financial and human capital frictions. So maybe you need policies that target both of these frictions if you're going to get, kind of the biggest bang for your buck. And we're definitely thinking about, more recent policies to promote, financial inclusion. So things like digital banking and peaks and et cetera. So I think I'm out of time. Thank you so much for your questions. If anyone has other questions, I'm very happy to hang around and talk about them.
Is there anybody else with a question? Because I asked that you may.
Go ahead, Walter.
First, a quick comment, because Julia is very young. There is Carlos Langoni, he died already. He wrote a book on income inequality in Brazil in the 1970s. And he showed some evidence in the book that the worsening of the inequality gets stronger in Brazil happened because of the supply of skilled workers. That was the key, the hypothesis he tested in his model. So it might be worthwhile taking a look at that book. The other thing that I believe would be interesting to look is you can compare your results for cities that had one private bank but no public bank prior to the program with cities that just had nothing, something like that.
We do. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to go through those results. They're in the paper. Our results are much stronger. Our results are much stronger for cities that didn't have anything, that had no private or public bank, which is about 40% of our treated cities had no bank at all. The other 60 had a private bank. And we do see positive effects on employment even for cities that did have a private bank, but the results are a lot larger if they had nothing.
Thank you.
Yes, so Julia, thanks for the presentation. So following up, I think that you had a slide in which you showed that the public banks had a much larger share of the growth, and the private banks were actually down. Well, I think
is that it?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess that part of it is probably driven by the incentives of the public banks, because they're probably, once you open a branch, the goal of the public bank is, okay, you probably have an incentive measure on not only, let's say, the total amount of let's say, credit, but also on the number of accounts and such, which should probably be coherent with the fact that you pointed out about the not going into the large scale companies and stuff. So that's probably some help in terms of looking at why that growth happened. So it's probably, there is an incentive of probably giving the most money to the larger number of firms or people or something. So that will be, let's say, that will probably explain why the effect is much stronger on the public banks than on the private banks or the corresponding banks. Does it make sense to you, or?
So if I saw something here, or at least around the time of the reform, if I saw something here on private banks, I'd be very concerned that what we're picking up is not the effect of the reform. I think in principle, it could be that, you know, as these cities are growing more, then maybe private banks would follow. I think that would be plausible, but it is something that we don't see. And then how do you kind of reconcile that these public banks are extending these loans and yet private banks don't find it profitable to come into these cities? I think we have the same model of the world when we think about this. I think you reconcile this by public banks. Yes, they have a profit motive. We know that, you know, these large federal banks make a profit consistently, but they also target other things. They target access, right? That was a very stated goal of this program, is that they also target access. So I think that that's a fair point in the sense that if you were to, let's say, redo this experiment, but you're randomizing the entry of a private bank, are you going to see kind of the exact same thing? Maybe not. But in terms of the causal interpretation, we're confident in, because, you know, these control cities also had a public bank, which, you know, are subject to the same objective function. So I will take that as a point on like the external validity, and I think that that's fair.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Well, Julia, thank you so much. A very intelligent, careful, and convincing work. Good luck with the future submission, and great job.
Thank you. Thanks.